Hello and welcome to this episode of ACAMS TV. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Kieran Beer. I am the Chief Content Director for Editorial and Content Analyst. And I have with me Frank Abagnale, whose fame I think is pretty far spread. And sitting here looking at you, I think of kind of like you had a pretty difficult start in life.
Yes.
And you've kind of done a lot of great things now with your life,
yeah, thank
including
God. Yes.
now this new book.
Yep.
But tell me a little bit about kind of how you got to where you are now and what you're doing now.
Well, most people know me, of course, from the movie Catch Me If You Can. I ran away from a broken home at 16 back in the 60s and ended up on the streets of New York. Realized very quickly I wouldn't survive as a 16-year-old, so I altered my license to make myself 26 years old.
Right.
And I started writing checks, and I impersonated an airline pilot for a couple years, was a doctor in a Georgia hospital, passed the state bar exams in Louisiana, practiced law there for about a year. By the time I was old enough to drink, I had written more than $2.5 million worth of bad checks. I was arrested.
And that was in dollars then,
yes,
too.
Yes, dollars then. I was arrested by the French police when I was 21, served time in the French prisons, was later extradited to Sweden, served time in the Swedish prisons, and eventually brought back to the United States, where a federal judge sentenced me to 12 years in a federal prison. I served 4 of those 12 years at a federal prison in Petersburg, Virginia. When I was 26 years old, the government offered to take me out of prison on the condition I go to work with an agency of the federal government for the remainder of my sentence or till my parole had been completed, and I agreed. I've been at the FBI now 43 years.
So you've done a lot of amazing work with the FBI in terms of kind of what was then traditional bank fraud stuff.
Excellent.
But we've moved into a whole new world of fraud, haven't we?
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about what you're doing now with regard to fighting fraud.
Yeah, I've had to change considerably over the 40 years because obviously back when I first started, I dealt mainly with embezzlements, check forgeries, counterfeiting. And as crime changed, I had to change. I had to learn about those crimes and how they were perpetrated. The big thing about criminals, it's all pretty much the same. If you go back even 100 years, it's basically the method they use and the technology available to them to do it. So I mainly understood the mind of the criminal. It was more about understanding the methods they were using now to commit those.
But there's a common crimes. Confidence act or a confidence man kind of thing or a confidence woman kind of thing.
Right.
And then there's the technique.
Right. And what's changed a lot is, 50 years ago there were confidence men and confidence women, and people called them con men. But they obviously had to deal with you one-on-one in person. So there was some emotion involved. They were obviously well-dressed, well-mannered, very likable. They won over your trust. And of course, they also had a little bit of compassion. So sometimes they didn't take people for all their money because they got to know the people very well. The difference today is that most of these criminals are sitting in their pajamas with a cup of coffee on a laptop in their bathroom and kitchen in Moscow. So they will never see you, you will never see them. So all the compassion's gone, and they'll literally take you for every dime because they don't know you, there's no emotion involved in the crime whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting, I don't know if you have any thoughts. I'm kind of thinking of like one of the great confidence men who is now in prison, Bernie Madoff, and you were talking about sort of sympathy for your victims and not sympathy, and here's someone who has not seemed to have sympathy, and kind of where do you place someone like that in the confidence case?
There'll always be people like that. I always was kind of surprised about, had he not said anything, and had he gone along and then started to say, well, the market crashed, so I can't pay all these people. And then they, of course,
that would have been a better.
Yeah, and they would have, taken him to court, and they would have sued him, and the federal government would have tried to press charges. But I always felt by the time they got around to that, he'd have died of old age. So I was very surprised that eventually his conscience or something got to him that he ended up admitting that he had done all those things.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you now, I know you're doing a lot, the fighting and teaching people about fraud is an ongoing thing for you.
Absolutely.
And I know you have a lot of, in the cyber age, you're giving people a lot of advice now, and it's partly, I think, in this book, right?
Yes.
About protecting passwords, and talk a little bit about the kinds of things. What's the 10-cent version of?
Right. Well, I've written several books, but they've all dealt with commercial crime. This is the first time I ever wrote a book that dealt with consumer-related crimes. And I was actually commissioned to write this book by ARP. It's their book. And consequently, I looked at all types of scams, perpetrated from sophisticated to amateur against elderly, against millennials. One of the things that was interesting to me in doing the research for the book is I found that millennials were scammed more often than seniors, but seniors lose more money because they have more money. Yeah. But it was amazing to me how much money people, individuals, veterans coming home from war have lost to scam artists. And again, many of them not in this country. So that becomes a difficult problem to prosecute. You can't go arrest them, you can't charge them, you can't extradite them and bring them back to face justice. So technology has made it a very, very safe crime.
And it's just funny, I mean, I just want to dwell on that for 1 second before moving on. Millennials actually are at least in frequency, more often victims of...
yes, they tend to be very
because
naive.
They just trust.
Well, they tend to be very naive.
They've lived online.
They tend to be very trusting. Yeah. The most common one I found in my research they fell for was they're on their computer, a pop-up comes, says it's Microsoft, you have malware on your computer, contact us at the 800 number, and then they pay a fee, but obviously it's a scam in there, but they just do it without really thinking it through.
So this is a book for consumers, but you've written other things. You know, the people here are financial institutions, absolutely. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts, advice, or kind of general concepts about financial institutions are really right now being the targets of hacking, although a lot of it is coming in from the consumer side where someone takes over an account of a consumer within the bank, but also the banks.
Let me share a couple of things with you. One is phishing emails. We get about 5,000 every day in the United States. We do track a lot of those. There's about $12 billion a year that comes from phishing emails the criminals receive. Out to about 155 countries, so we know that most of those phishing emails are generated outside the United States. What's been interesting to me is looking at these phishing emails for so many years now, how sophisticated they become. So I have one come across my desk, ironically was a technology company in Southern California, 4,000 employees, supposedly from the CEO to the CFO. And it said, "Good morning, Jim. Wonderful dinner at your home last night. Please thank your wife, Helen. My wife, Carol, and I truly enjoyed your company. As I mentioned to you, I'm attending a conference in Nashville, Tennessee this week. I'll be out of the office till next Monday. I forgot to mention to you to wire $35,000 to this charity. Please take care of it before 11 o'clock. Here's the instructions, signed Bob." What happens today is they go to social media where the CEO's already had pictures of his wife and him, her name. The CFO has his wife and her name. 2 months earlier, he registered to attend that conference in Nashville, said he was going to the conference on Facebook. So they take all of that information to make it sound so real. So it's not any longer the misspellings and the improper vocabulary. They're very, very sophisticated and they're very, very timely.
And as you say, the amount of labor involved in that may not really be all that much, especially if you're in your pajamas someplace far away.
When it comes to breaches, and I've been involved in every breach going back to TJ Maxx some 15 years ago, up until Facebook, Capital One, and Marriott Hotels. Every breach in my career occurs because somebody in that company did something they weren't supposed to do, or somebody in that company failed to do something they were supposed to do. Hackers do not cause breaches, people do. Hackers just look for open doors, and God knows there's a lot of open doors even in the smallest to the largest companies. And in the case of Equifax, they didn't up to take their technology, they didn't fix their security patches. So obviously the hacker was able to get in, sit there for a couple of months to realize what he wanted to steal. That's what I find most of the time. So what I've realized is that the most important thing any company can do is to teach their employees that the most important job they have is keeping the information entrusted to them safe. That's everyone from the CEO to the janitor. But you have to educate people to do that. For example, social engineering, there is no technology, there never will be any technology. Even AI cannot stop social engineering. Only educating people to know they're being socially engineered. So that when they're at that call center, they know they're being socially engineered because they've been taught to recognize it. Education is the most powerful tool to fighting crime. So I've found over my 43 years that whether I'm educating FBI agents or I'm educating bankers or I'm educating consumers, if I basically say to them, this is how it works, this is how they do it, and give them the knowledge, they're smart enough to make sure it doesn't happen to them, but they have to have the tools to know to do it.
But it is daunting because the bad guys just keep sending all different sorts of...
Every day there's something new, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things that sort of interests me in reading about you is your concerns about blockchain. Talk to me a little bit about that. You know, blockchain is out there now as the thing that's going to make us more secure, but you have concerns around privacy in blockchain or something.
Well, there's a few things about blockchain.
Okay.
I like blockchain, and I certainly believe it is the wave of the future. Insurance companies, banks, vital records will be kept by blockchain. But if I give you false information to begin with, and it goes in the blockchain, then that false identity stays in the blockchain. There is social issues, like we wouldn't be able to have a witness protection program under blockchain. We'd have to figure ways around that. We'd have to figure
because,
ways...
wait, describe that to me, because...
Once you put it in the person's real name,
I'm always going to be able to...
You can always find back to who that person is.
Yeah.
And same way with social issues, like if someone's changing their sexual orientation or anything like that. So, but those are like any technology, you work those things out, and I believe that blockchain will work all that out, and eventually that'll be a good tool. I think what we do need to get rid of, and I've written about this for many years, is that I am a true believer that passwords are for tree houses. They're a 1964 technology that was invented when I was 16 years old. I'm 71, and we are still using passwords within the government, within banking, everywhere. And we have the technology now to eliminate the need for passwords, so I'm hoping that we'll move to that very quickly and get rid of passwords, because when you look at all the malware, ransomware, all the intrusions, they all come back to passwords.
Right, and I'm thinking that maybe you're referring to like biometrics and that kind of thing.
I'm not a big fan on biometrics because, as you know, if I take a picture of you, I transfer it to a digital line of numbers, letters, and so on. If I capture those and then I replay them, then I am you again. Same way with a wire. If you send a wire and I capture it and replay it, the wire goes through again, or I can reroute the wire. So I worked with a company out in Arizona because the government was very interested in no passwords. And I remember saying to the CEO that don't go down this road unless you first invent anti-replay. You have to have anti-replay before you ever do away with passwords. And so they started out inventing anti-replay, they patented it, and then they moved into the no password world, where now more and more companies are converting over to no passwords.
Wait, so what does that look like, just so that I understand?
So let's say, for example, if we take one of the top 5 largest banks in America, either one of them, they spend about $100 million a year just resetting passwords in their call center. So no passwords eliminates $100 million out of their expense. But when I call the call center now, they'll recognize me by my cell phone, but then the bank will say to me, would you press our app on your phone? And when I press that app, they will know it's me. There's no security question. So that means the person in the call center doesn't have my social security number, doesn't have my date of birth, doesn't have my mother's maiden name, doesn't have any personal information about me, because that's just another window of opportunity that you eliminate. They know it's me by my phone. So there is an ad on TV now getting a lot of attention. Serena Williams is going through the shopping center of a market, and she's in her jogging outfit, she has a cell phone, and she sees a necklace she really liked. So she goes over to an ATM of a major US bank, she presses the app on her phone, and she gets her money, and she leaves. No card, no password, and that's that technology. And
presumably the phone kind of knows her, so that I just can't pick up her phone. And
right, exactly.
I don't know the thing. I'm going to come into Serena Williams' phone anytime soon.
No.
But
and again, it's, you know, there are different tiers of that. There's 2-tier, there's 3-tier, 4-tier. So the government would be interested in 4-tier. But we absolutely are moving down the road, and I'm very glad to see it after all these years that we do away with passwords.
And I also, in thinking about this interview and speaking with you, you're not a fan of cryptocurrencies.
No, I think it's first of all, it's extremely risky. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've closed down more than 120 exchanges that were all corrupt. We've had problems with hackers stealing money from cryptocurrency. It's also a very great way to hide money. So, I mean, it's a great thing for criminals to be able to have cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, things like that. So we're just making it easier for the criminal to commit crimes and then hide their benefit of those crimes.
Yeah, and it's not quite clear whether it's an asset or it's a currency or whatever it is.
No.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking this time to talk with me here on ACAMS TV, and I want to thank McKinsey & Company, who've made your presence here possible, in addition to you making your presence here possible. And thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Frank Abagnale.
Thank you. Thank you very much.